Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson didn't hold back when they went after Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. In a wild, explosive live discussion, they tore apart his leadership in a way that had people across the country talking. Joe Rogan started off strong, calling Walz a weirdo and questioning everything about him from his political decisions to his personal life. Rogan made it clear that he didn't have hard proof of anything illegal, but everything about Walz gave him a bad feeling. There was something off about the man, he said, and in his opinion, people like that should never be in power. Tucker Carlson, meanwhile, added a colder but just as brutal tone. He didn't shout or make jokes. He stared into the camera with that intense look and calmly explained why Walz's entire political image was falling apart. He talked about how Walz lied about being in Tiananmen Square and about being a football coach. It's that kind of lying, Carlson said, might be common in politics, but it shouldn't be ignored. And Walz didn't just tell lies, he also let others say things that weren't true about him and never corrected them. According to both Carlson and Rogan, this showed a pattern of dishonesty. But it didn't stop there. The two hosts went deep into Walz's record as governor, especially his response to the pandemic. Rogan pointed out how strange and unfair the COVID rules in Minnesota were under Walz. You could walk into a weed shop, but gyms were closed. People were forced to wear 2 masks outside in freezing temperatures. Kids were stuck at home trying to learn math through video games while their teachers filed lawsuits over Zoom, and Rogan, always sarcastic, joked that Minnesota kids were probably using AI just to make sense of their homework. He said the state had turned into a joke, with leaders who made rules that didn't even make sense. Carlson took aim at Walz's use of emergency powers. He said Walz acted like Minnesota was his personal kingdom. He created rule after rule, choking the economy while acting like he was the hero. The way Carlson explained it, Walz didn't just make mistakes, he abused his power and then tried to cover it all with smooth talk and long-winded plans. He didn't fix problems, he made them worse. Restaurants were boarded up, small businesses were destroyed, and families were forced to flee the state. Meanwhile, the government threw around words like equity and community wellness instead of offering real help. Rogan also couldn't ignore Walz's personal decisions, like putting tampons in boys' bathrooms. Rogan laughed at the idea and said it was the kind of thing that showed how out of touch Walz had become. He called it nonsense and part of a bigger problem where leaders were focused more on looking good than actually doing good. Walz, according to Rogan, was the kind of person who would rather host a meditation seminar for criminals than do something real about crime. Crime was another big topic. Carlson painted a grim picture of Minneapolis, a city that went from being called Minnesota Nice to Minnesota Heist. Police departments were being defunded while criminals were running free. Stores were being looted, people were getting carjacked. And yet the official response was to create surveys and workshops instead of arresting anyone. Rogan mocked this too. He said that a dad taking his kid to a playground during lockdown would get a fine, but a guy stealing a TV during a riot would get a pass. That, he said, was the level of madness Walz had created. Even Walz's wife got pulled into the chaos. Rogan brought up a video of her talking about keeping the windows open during the riots so she could smell the burning tires. That moment, Rogan said, showed just how strange and detached the whole administration was. Who in their right mind wants to smell burning rubber from riots? And to shake hands with your wife during that kind of chaos? Rogan called it weird, unsettling, and just plain wrong. Education in Minnesota took a huge hit under Walz too. Rogan and Carlson both ripped into how the school system was more focused on feelings and ideologies than on reading, writing, or math. Kids were being taught about microaggressions and systemic issues before they could even do long division. Teachers were being trained to dismantle hierarchies instead of teaching lessons. And Carlson pointed out that millions were being spent on consultants while the actual education system collapsed. For him, it wasn't just a policy problem, it was a betrayal of children and families. The conversation turned even more intense when they started talking about Walz's military background. Carlson mentioned how Walz let people believe he served in Afghanistan even though he didn't. He didn't correct the record, didn't stop the rumors. That, according to Carlson, was another example of Walz being dishonest, always trying to sound better than he was. Rogan called it fake heroism, pretending to be something you're not just to look good. Together, Rogan and Carlson formed a devastating team. One used jokes and sarcasm, the other cold facts and steady anger. And while they came from different styles, they agreed on one thing. Tim Walz had failed his state. They said he had turned Minnesota into a place where people were afraid to speak out, afraid to question rules, and unsure of what was coming next. And they made it clear that they weren't afraid to say the things others wouldn't. Even the new Minnesota state flag came under fire. Rogan joked that it looked like the Somali flag and questioned why Walz felt the need to change it at all. Carlson said the whole thing was just another distraction, another move to keep people focused on symbols instead of substance. They both agreed that real leadership was about action, not about changing flags or writing reports full of buzzwords. Their discussion was more than just a takedown, it was a full-on political demolition. They exposed every corner of Walz's leadership, from his lies about his past to the chaos he let unfold during the riots. They pointed out the hypocrisy of a governor who shut down gyms but kept liquor stores open, who banned school but allowed protests, who claimed to care about safety while letting crime skyrocket. And what was Walz's response to all this? Silence, not a tweet, not a press conference, not even a statement. He watched quietly as millions saw Rogan and Carlson tear apart his record. For them, it was just another day. But for Walz, it might have been the beginning of the end. Because once the truth comes out in front of that many people, there's no putting it back. Rogan and Carlson didn't want to become politicians. They didn't want to run for office or make campaign promises. They just wanted to speak honestly, to call out nonsense when they saw it, and to hold leaders accountable. And in this case, they did it with brutal clarity. Walz may have thought he could ride out the backlash, but with two of the most influential voices in media going after him, that plan may have fallen apart. In the end, their takedown of Walz wasn't just about one man. It was about a larger problem: leaders who say one thing and do another, who hide behind good intentions while making bad choices. And as Rogan and Carlson pointed out, the cost of that kind of leadership is paid by regular people. The business owners who went bankrupt, the kids who fell behind in school, the families who no longer feel safe in their own neighborhoods. It was a warning to every other politician who thinks they can do whatever they want without being called out. Rogan and Carlson made it clear: you lie, if you fail, if you hurt the people you're supposed to help, they will speak up. When they do, it won't be pretty. It'll be loud, sharp, and unforgettable. Just like this takedown of Tim Walz. ChatGPT said, the takedown didn't just stop at education, crime, and pandemic policies. Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson began pulling apart the deeper layers of Governor Walz's leadership style. They spoke about how Walz turned every decision into a top-down order instead of listening to the people. Rogan pointed out that Walz acted like a substitute teacher who suddenly got handed real power and didn't know what to do with it, so he just kept writing more rules. Carlson agreed and added that Walz treated citizens like children, expecting blind obedience while offering no real solutions. They criticized how Walz presented himself in public. Always calm, always smiling, always acting like everything was under control. But behind the scenes, the state was falling apart. Small businesses were closing left and right. Mental health crises were rising. Schools were struggling, and the police force demoralized and stripped of support. Tucker said Walz didn't want to be a governor. He wanted to be a manager at a wellness retreat who handed out pamphlets about inner peace while the building was on fire. Joe Rogan highlighted a particularly frustrating moment when he talked about how people in Minnesota had to follow rules that made no sense. He laughed at how you could go buy alcohol but not go to the gym. You could stand in line for groceries but not sit on a park bench. It wasn't just hypocrisy. He said, "What stupidity?" Carlson said the same thing in a different way. He brought up how laws should protect people and serve justice, not confuse them. And under walls, the law had become something people feared, not respected. They also took a strong stance on how walls used fear to stay in power. Rogan pointed out that when people are scared, they're easier to control. And during the pandemic, walls leaned into that fear, issuing rule after rule and shutting down any debate. Carlson said it wasn't leadership, it was control. And worse, it was control that crushed businesses, silenced parents, and punished anyone who dared speak up. Both of them agreed, that's not what democracy looks like. One of the most shocking parts of the conversation was when they talked about the riots in Minnesota. Carlson brought up how the governor allowed the city to burn, and instead of taking action, he stood back. Rogan jumped in and said the most insane part was how Walls's wife said she kept the windows open so she could enjoy the smell of burning tires. That moment, they both said, showed how disconnected the leadership had become. Real people were scared. Real people lost their homes, their businesses, their peace of mind. And the governor's family. They treated it like a strange experiment. Even Walls's military record came under fire. Rogan and Carlson didn't claim he never served. They just said it was suspicious how he let people think. He was more of a war hero than he really was. He didn't correct stories that said he deployed 2 dangerous war zones. He didn't set the record straight when people said he was a combat leader. Carlson said it was all part of the same pattern. Walls let others believe lies because it made him look better. And that kind of behavior, they said, shows you everything you need to know. Rogan kept hitting hard. He mocked the state's efforts to replace the police with community groups trained by online influencers. He said you don't stop a carjacker with yoga, and the internet exploded with laughter. Carlson added that real reform doesn't come from slogans or hashtags. It comes from leaders who are honest, brave, and willing to make tough decisions. And Walls, he said, was none of those things. They also brought up how Minnesota had become a warning sign for the rest of the country. Carlson called it a test case for what happens when feelings are placed above facts. When rules are made not to protect people, but to look good in headlines. When leaders care more about press conferences than actual progress, Rogan said the state had turned into a cartoon version of what good government should be full of. Ideas that sounded nice but did nothing to fix real problems. And then there was the issue of school discipline. Rogan and Carlson both pointed out that under Walls, even holding students accountable was seen as unfair. Discipline was labeled as oppressive. Standardized testing was called racist. And real learning, it got replaced by trendy ideas that made students feel good but left them unprepared for life. Rogan joked that kids in Minnesota didn't know multiplication tables, but they could explain social justice theories. That's not education, he said. It's babysitting with buzzwords. As the conversation kept rolling, Rogan got more and more fired up. He brought up stories of gym owners getting arrested for opening their businesses during lockdowns. Meanwhile, rioters walked free. One gym owner, a woman, served 60 days in jail just for refusing to close. Rogan called her a hero. Carlson agreed and said it was disgusting that someone trying to feed their family was treated like a criminal, while actual criminals got released with no consequences. The frustration was real. It was shared by people across the country. Clips from the segment were spreading like wildfire. Memes, videos, reaction posts, they filled social media. People weren't just watching. They were nodding along, finally hearing someone say what they were thinking. Rogan and Carlson had given a voice to the anger that so many felt during the pandemic but were too afraid to express. They brought up how Walls had changed the state flag to something that looked like the Somali flag. Rogan questioned why a state with deep American roots would change its flag for no clear reason. Carlson called it symbolic politics changing. Small things while the big problems get worse. Flags don't fix crime. Colors don't cure poverty. If a flag is more important to a governor than schools or jobs, Carlson said, then that governor has lost touch with reality. It wasn't just about criticizing Walz, it was about warning people that this kind of leadership is spreading. Rogan and Carlson said that if people don't speak up, more states will follow the same path. More leaders will copy the same broken methods. More kids will grow up confused. More cities will fall apart. And more regular people will pay the price. By the end of the segment, it was clear that Rogan and Carlson weren't just talking, they were launching a full-on takedown, a roast. So thorough, so biting, so packed with facts and sarcasm that it left no doubt Tim Walz's image had been shattered. And the silence from his office only made it worse. No defense. No response. Just a man watching his reputation crumble in real time. Rogan said that leaders like Walz don't think they'll ever get called out because the media protects them. But now with platforms like podcasts and independent news, that protection is gone. Carlson added that the truth always finds a way out, and when it does, it hits hard, like it did here. Like it did with every joke, every fact, every moment of this live dissection. So while Walz might still have the title of governor, the respect, the trust, that was gone. Rogan and Carlson made sure of it. And the people watching from their homes, phones, and laptops were finally seeing the truth without filters or fancy headlines. They were hearing it raw, direct, and honest. And once you hear that, you can't go back. This wasn't just another political debate. This was a reckoning. A moment where two very different voices came together with one clear message. Enough is enough. The lies, the failures, the excuses, it's time to face them. Tim Walz may have had power, but after this, he didn't have the people. Not anymore.